Before the show starts, drop a comment below with where you're watching from, then sit back, relax, and get ready for some chilling stories. I took the school bus home every day. It wasn't exactly by choice. My parents worked late, and our house was too far for me to walk. Most days, I was the last one off, since we lived on the outskirts of town. The ride was long, quiet, and honestly kind of boring. But one afternoon, I noticed something. A man. He was standing near the bus stop on Route 6, the loneliest stretch of road before we reached the suburbs. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, watching. He had a heavy jacket, even though it was warm, and his hands were stuffed into his pockets. His face was partially obscured by the hood he wore, but I could feel his eyes on the bus as we drove by. It was weird, but I didn't think much of it. Maybe he was waiting for someone. The next day, he was there again. Same place, same clothes, same stillness. And the day after that, that's when it started to feel wrong. I wasn't the only one who noticed. A couple of other students pointed him out, whispering and laughing about how creepy he looked. But the bus just kept rolling past, like always, and he never moved. Then on Thursday, something changed. He wasn't just watching the bus. He was watching me. I was sitting by the window when I made eye contact with him, just for a second. But in that second, I knew. His head tilted slightly, like he recognized me, like he had been waiting for me to look. I felt a cold, sick feeling crawl up my spine. The next morning, I almost considered asking my parents for a ride. But I told myself I was being paranoid. He was probably harmless, just some guy loitering around. That evening, I regretted not listening to my gut, because that was the night the bus broke down. It happened right in the middle of Route 6, just a few hundred feet from where he always stood. The bus sputtered, jerked, and then died. The driver, Mr. Willis, grumbled under his breath and got out to check the engine. There were only 5 of us left on board, and I could feel the unease spreading. Outside, the sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the road. And then I saw him, standing in the exact same place. But this time, he started moving. I tensed as he stepped onto the road, slowly making his way toward the bus. His pace was unhurried, deliberate. He wasn't just some random guy anymore. He was coming straight for us. Should we say something? One of the other students muttered. No one answered. We just sat there, watching as he got closer. Then he stopped, right in front of the bus, and he smiled. It was the most unnerving thing I'd ever seen. His teeth were visible just beneath the hood, stretched into a grin that didn't reach his eyes. Then, without breaking eye contact, he knocked on the bus door, 3 times. No one moved. No one breathed. The door stayed shut. But then, from behind us, a soft metallic creak. The emergency exit at the back of the bus. I turned slowly, dread curling in my stomach. The door was open. No one had touched it. No one had moved. And yet, it was swinging, just slightly, as if someone had just slipped inside. I didn't dare turn back to the front, because deep down I already knew. The man was no longer outside. I sat frozen in my seat, every muscle locked in place. The other students must have noticed too, because no one spoke. No one screamed. We just felt it, the shift in the air, the realization that something was terribly wrong. Then footsteps. Slow, careful, coming from the back of the bus. I forced myself to turn my head just a little, just enough to see. The aisle was empty, but I knew someone was there. The others were all facing forward, staring at the closed bus doors, too scared to even glance behind them. The only sound was the faint creaking of the emergency exit, swaying slightly as if it had just been disturbed. Then, a shuffle, a whisper of movement, and the softest exhale right behind me. I shot up from my seat. One of the girls gasped. A guy in the front seat jolted and turned around. But there was no one there. The bus felt suffocating, the air too thick, the silence too loud. Then, a hand slammed against the front window. We all jumped. The man was still outside. Or was he? My mind raced. I had seen him standing by the door just seconds ago. But if he was still out there, then who had come through the back? The man grinned wider. He lifted one hand and pointed directly at me. I took a step back. The bus lights flickered. A voice whispered in my ear, "You should have never looked." I ran. So did the others. We shoved our way toward the front, pressing ourselves against the door, banging on it, screaming for Mr. Willis. The driver finally appeared from the front, wiping grease off his hands. He frowned at us, confused. "What the hell is going on?" "Open the door," someone shouted. "Now." Mr. Willis sighed, muttering under his breath as he pulled the lever. The doors hissed open. We bolted out. But when I looked back, the man was gone. Not on the road. Not near the trees. Just gone. The emergency exit at the back was locked, same as always. Mr. Willis didn't believe us. He told us we'd been watching too many horror movies, that the man had probably walked off when he saw the driver coming back. But I know what I saw, and I know what I heard. I never took the bus again after that. I begged my parents to drive me, and when that wasn't possible, I walked. I didn't care how long it took, but sometimes when I drive home at night, I catch a glimpse of something in my rearview mirror. A figure, standing by the side of the road, watching, waiting, and every time I blink, he's just a little closer. I never minded riding the bus alone. Most days, I sat by myself in the back, headphones in, staring out the window. People liked to talk about how creepy it was to be the last one on board, but I didn't really care. It was quiet, peaceful, until that night. It had been raining since the afternoon, a slow, steady drizzle that left everything looking blurred and distorted under the streetlights. I had stayed late for tutoring, which meant by the time I got on the bus, everyone else was already gone. Except for Carl, the driver. Carl had been driving the school bus for as long as I could remember. He was one of those guys who didn't talk much, just nodded when you got on, grunted when you got off. I always figured he didn't care much for conversation, which was fine by me. That night, the bus felt colder than usual. Maybe it was the rain, or maybe it was just my imagination, but something about it felt off. I sat in my usual spot at the back, watching the raindrops race each other down the fogged-up glass. The dim glow of the streetlights made everything outside look hazy, like the world was slightly out of focus. That's when I noticed it. My reflection. It was delayed. I lifted my hand slightly, just a little test. And in the window, my reflection lifted its hand a second later. I froze. My breath hitched, but I tried to stay calm. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe my brain was lagging behind. I rubbed my eyes, shook my head, and looked again. It was normal now. I exhaled slowly, laughing a little at myself. Get a grip, Marcus. But just as I was about to look away, my reflection smiled. I wasn't smiling. Every muscle in my body locked up. The version of me in the glass had the same features, the same posture, but its lips curled into a slow, unnatural grin. A grin I hadn't made. I turned away instantly, my heart hammering. I didn't look at the window again. I forced myself to stare straight ahead, watching Carl through the reflection in his mirror. And that's when I saw something worse. A shadowy figure, sitting in the seat behind me. I felt the blood drain from my face. That seat had been empty when I got on. Slowly, cautiously, I turned my head to look. Nothing. The seat was empty. But when I looked forward again, the reflection still showed someone sitting behind me. I gripped the edge of my seat, my breath coming in short, uneven gasps. The reflection wasn't lying. Someone, or something, was sitting behind me. But when I turned around again, the seat was empty. Just the worn fabric and the faint scent of old vinyl. I wanted to tell myself I was imagining it, that maybe it was some trick of the dim lighting and rain-streaked glass. But my gut told me otherwise, because the longer I sat there, the heavier the air around me felt. Like I wasn't alone, like something was waiting. I forced myself to breathe, slowly, deliberately. I wasn't going to panic. I was just going to sit here, ignore the reflection, and wait for my stop. But then, a soft shift of fabric behind me. I heard it, clear as day, like someone leaning forward. I felt my body tense, every nerve screaming at me to move, to look, to run. But I didn't. I couldn't, because suddenly the cold, unmistakable sensation of breath brushed against the back of my neck. And then a whisper, so quiet I almost didn't catch it. "Look at me." I squeezed my eyes shut. My hands dug into my knees, nails pressing against denim. No, no, don't look. My pulse pounded in my ears. I could feel the presence behind me now, heavy, suffocating. It wasn't just that someone was sitting there. It was that they were leaning closer. I held my breath, forcing myself to stay still, forcing myself to not turn around. A sharp creak echoed through the bus. The driver's mirror shifted slightly as Carl adjusted it, just enough for me to see. For the briefest second, I caught a glimpse of what was behind me. I wished I hadn't. It was a shape, barely visible in the dim reflection. Not just a shadow, not just a trick of the light. A figure. Its face was blurred, indistinct, like something trapped between one reality and another. But its eyes, they were locked onto mine through the mirror. Wide, unblinking, too many. I couldn't breathe. I tore my gaze away, staring down at my lap, my chest rising and falling in panicked, shallow breaths. It's not real. It's not real. It's not real. The bus lurched. We were at my stop. I shot up, stumbling toward the front. The lights overhead flickered as I moved, the cold growing sharper, like something was reaching for me. Carl didn't say a word as I rushed toward the doors. But just as I stepped down onto the pavement, just as I thought I was finally safe, I heard him mutter under his breath. Soft, almost regretful. It always chooses the quiet ones. I turned back, my mouth dry. But Carl wasn't looking at me. He was staring at the mirror, his expression unreadable. The doors hissed shut, and the bus rumbled away, disappearing into the dark. I stood in my driveway for a long time, my fingers still shaking. The house was dark. My parents weren't home yet. I should have gone inside, but I didn't, because in the reflection of my bedroom window, I saw the bus, still sitting at my stop, the engine off, the lights dead, and someone standing inside, watching me. The school bus always felt different at night. During the day it was loud, kids shouting, music blasting from half-broken headphones, someone always messing around in the back. But by the time my stop came, most of the students were gone. The bus would grow quiet, the only sounds being the hum of the engine and the occasional squeak of the windshield wipers. I never minded. I actually liked the silence, until I noticed her. It was a Wednesday when I first saw the girl sitting alone a few rows ahead. I didn't recognize her. That wasn't too weird. Our school was big, and I didn't know everyone. But something about her felt off. She was sitting perfectly still, her face turned toward the window. Her long, dark hair covered most of her features, and she didn't move. Not once. I figured she was just another quiet kid like me. Maybe she didn't like talking. The next night, she was there again. Same seat. Same position. Completely motionless. I felt a small chill creep up my spine. I had been taking this bus for years, and I knew the usual riders. But I had never seen her before this week. And what bothered me more, no one else seemed to notice her. Not the handful of students left on board. Not even the driver. At one point, I caught my own reflection in the window and thought about checking hers. But something inside me told me not to. That night, I barely slept. The next evening, when I stepped onto the bus, I felt it immediately. The temperature. It was colder than usual. I pulled my hoodie tighter around me and walked to my usual seat. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help it. My eyes flickered toward her. She was still there. But this time, she was sitting closer. Not by much. Just one row back from the night before. I tried to ignore the sinking feeling in my stomach. Tried to convince myself I was just imagining things. But when I glanced up at the driver's mirror, I saw him gripping the wheel tightly. Jaw clenched. Eyes fixed straight ahead, like he was trying not to look back. I took a step back from the door, my stomach knotting tighter with every passing second. The driver still hadn't looked at me. His fingers clenched around the wheel, the skin stretched tight over his knuckles. His breathing was shallow, controlled, like he was forcing himself to stay calm, like he'd done this before. I swallowed hard. "Open the door," I whispered. His grip tightened. His shoulders tensed. "You have to wait until she gets off first." I turned slowly, every nerve in my body screaming at me not to. The girl hadn't moved. She was still sitting there, her face half turned toward me, her two large eyes unblinking. Something about her felt wrong, like she wasn't just sitting there, but watching in a way I couldn't understand. I shivered. The cold was getting worse, seeping through my hoodie, sinking into my skin. My breath came out in small, visible puffs. "Please," I said louder this time, my voice edged with panic. "Just let me off." The driver finally looked at me through the mirror. His face was tight, pale, and I saw something there I hadn't noticed before. Fear. His lips barely moved when he spoke. "She never leaves." My heart stopped. I turned back to the girl, my pulse hammering. She was closer. I hadn't seen her move, hadn't even felt it happen. But she was now just a few rows away, her head tilted, her mouth just slightly open. Like she was curious. I pressed myself against the bus door, gripping the metal rail so tightly my fingers ached. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. I squeezed my eyes shut. "Wake up. You're dreaming. Wake up." The lights flickered again. The bus engine gave a low, shuddering groan. The air felt thick, heavy, pressing against my chest. And then, a whisper, right next to my ear. "You saw me first." I shoved against the door, slamming my fists into the glass. "Open it!" I screamed. "Please." The driver exhaled shakily. Then, without a word, he reached for the lever. The doors hissed open. I didn't wait. I bolted down the steps, leaping onto the pavement, nearly slipping as my shoes hit the cold, wet ground. I didn't stop running until I reached my driveway. I turned back, my breath coming in quick, uneven gasps. The bus was still there, idling. The doors were still open. But the girl, she was gone. The seats were empty. For a long moment, the driver just sat there, staring straight ahead. Then, finally, he closed the doors and drove away. I stood outside for a long time, my body trembling, my breath fogging in the night air. I didn't sleep that night. And the next morning, when the bus pulled up to my stop, I didn't get on. I never did again. But sometimes late at night, when I'm alone in my room, I catch my reflection in the window. And for a split second, I see someone sitting behind me,